Hi, welcome to Connecting the Dots, the podcast where we share our stories from the battlefield of consulting. I'm your host, Johnny Hill.
Hi, I'm Andy Nichols.
I'm Phil Gambling.
Hey, I'm Kareem Jamal.
Today, we're talking all about retrospectives, what they are, how to do them well, and common pitfalls to watch out for. Let's get started. So I think we should start off just by defining, for those who don't know, what is a retrospective, or how it's often abbreviated, just a retro.
So a retrospective is kind of one of those traditional agile ceremonies. At least that's how it's typically thought about, right? After a sprint, it's a meeting where the team gets together and talks about what went well, what they could have improved, basically looking back on their performance and just fine-tuning. Agile teams are always iterating, you're always trying to further improve the processes, but it doesn't exclusively have to be part of Agile or even software development. I've actually used retros in totally other contexts with just other groups. Really, it's like any team that's working towards a common goal and just a checkpoint in how they're doing and how they could get towards that goal more efficiently.
And they can be at multiple steps, right? You can have a sprint retro, you can have a project retro, even an account retro, just at certain milestones to stop, take a breath, and look back, and then use that to influence your path forward.
Yeah, I think that's important. Is you don't have to have a retro at a specific time. You can use them at key events or key milestones, or just generally if things have been going, for a period of time. It's good sometimes just to have a retro to see how people are feeling. Are they still fully engaged? Are they still enthusiastic? There's no real need to follow a set pattern with the retro. It's more a kind of touchy-feely thing sometimes as to where you are in the project.
I think it's also worth recognizing that retrospectives can take all sorts of shapes and sizes. The more formal ones that are usually part of like the Agile process are usually a longer meeting and there's more structure. But it can also be more of an informal, let's all take a moment to look back. What's one thing that went well? What's one thing we could all improve? It could be asynchronous and like over Slack or a survey. But generally speaking, when we're talking about retrospectives, it's more of a formal meeting that kind of caps off a stage in a project or is a transition point, right? It's a time to take a break, look back, figure out what could be better, and move forward. So given that, let's talk about some of the reasons why retros are important and how they can help your project.
I think it's an indicator of like a healthy team, because I can think of situations where just no one even spends any time looking back at how they're doing and just kind of goes along with the status quo, however dysfunctional it might be. So I think it's just a sign the team is working well together, just making sure everybody's heard, right? Like everybody on the team has a voice. I think that's an important time for that.
On large and complex projects, it's too easy to just put your head down and continue working and feel like this is the way to do it. And it's dangerous to not poke your head up every now and then and say, hey, is everyone okay? Are we working as effectively as we could be? Because not only does it, if things aren't great, not only does it take a toll on the team, but also you could be burning more time or money or what have you, doing things in inefficient manners when there are better ways to do it. And so it's always nice to come together every now and then, like a kumbaya style, and share what sort of pain points you're facing, what things we could be doing better. So that reflection is key, especially on long-term projects.
Yeah, I think on long-term and larger projects where you have a bigger team, I've used retrospectives not just to look at the technical aspects or the project aspects, but to talk about what's happened on the business side in conjunction with the work that we're doing, because it's very common, I think, on those larger projects for the developers to sometimes get detached from the business objectives. So I think it's always good to bring the team up to speed on, what's happened, what were the successes on the business side, how did what we were building and delivering actually add the value that the project's trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. And in a similar vein, I think it's a helpful time to take a step back and say, what's going well? What are the things we can celebrate? It's easy to get in a mode of, especially when you're on a project where there's always things to be done or fixed or improved. It can be easy to kind of get stuck in that mindset, but taking a step back and saying, "Hey, here's how far we've come in the last 2 months or whatever. Here's a way that I've seen this colleague of mine excel in learning this new skill or implementing something in a new way or whatever it is." It's a helpful way to kind of take a step back and rally together as a team, encourage each other, recognize kind of where things are going. I think we kind of talked about that in the previous podcast, talking about burnout, where it was like, if you're constantly heads down and you don't take a moment to step back and like, what's the value in what we're doing? Also similar to what Andy was saying about how is this going on the business side? What are the successes we're having there as a result of the work we're doing here? You can kind of get that tunnel vision and it can start to feel like a grind. So having that context can be helpful and just an opportunity to step back and celebrate what is going well. It's easy to miss those kinds of things if you don't intentionally take a break and look for it.
And speaking of burnout, I think actually that might be if a team member on a retro seems like they're just really venting, seems like a
Hmm.
lot of frustrations coming out, it might be an early symptom that, hey, someone should really check in with them. Are they okay? Or are we putting too much burden on them and they're burning
Hmm.
out? And that might be like spilling out, in that retro might be where they're, showing us that there's a problem.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think like I was one other point when you were bringing up celebrating the wins, and I think that's actually been one of the features of the retro that I have enjoyed in recent years. Like the projects I'm on now, the person who runs the retro explicitly has us call out like shout outs, like,
Mm.
name someone on the team and something they did in these are our sprint retros, that they did that was particularly good or useful. And honestly, I feel like that ends up being a good chunk of our content is really the shout outs. And we're really good about, calling out and congratulating one another. And like you said, it's like it helps to make you feel like, well, one, you're part of the team, you're valued. I think that's a missed opportunity if you don't spend part of your retro on that.
Hmm.
Yeah, it really lets you focus on the things that you would otherwise not focus on, right? So just like stand-ups are syncs for your immediate tasks at hand, and
Mhm.
your sprint demos are syncs with your client, right? These retros are really syncs for your internal meta management execution type tasks that are never really in focus unless you take the initiative to make them in focus.
Yeah, it also creates an environment where it's safe to raise concerns or larger picture, like, hey, what if we tried this? Because a lot of times that's not the context for a demo or a stand-up. And not to say that if you see something wrong, wait until it's time for a retro and then you can say something, but it kind of helps get people in the right headspace to say, hey, I've noticed this thing we're doing seems really inefficient. What if we tried this? And even
Mhm.
if that idea doesn't get implemented as a result of the retro, it starts the conversation and someone else might say, oh yeah, that reminds me of something we did on this other project or at a previous job.
Mhm.
Then that really helped. It can help spark those ideas and kind of get the cogs turning when a lot of times you're not thinking in that mental space in those other kinds of meetings. So those things don't come up as easily. So it helps create space for that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of good ideas really come up in retros too. Like someone just had that moment where they're like, I've been thinking about this for the last couple of weeks, and what if we did this? I mean, that often leads to right major improvements, maybe new features or product ideas. I'm seeing that a lot with the group I work with now. Often, really, some good ideas come out of retro that then become something gets promoted to that. Oh, that would really benefit the client,
Mhm.
the end user if we did this, and not something even our product manager had considered.
Okay, so we've talked a good bit about why retros are important, the purpose that they serve. But let's talk about some of the ways that they can kind of go off the rails, or I guess common pitfalls to avoid, ways that you can help make sure the retro is on the right track.
Not giving it its due importance. So trying to rush it, or just because you have to check a box or something, trying to schedule it on a whim, or
Mhm.
saying we're too busy to have one, so not having it at all. All those things will not result in a good retro. For that, you need time to prep a little individually, and people come with their thoughts. So when you have the session, it is a lot more productive with genuine ideas and feelings and such on ways to improve on what we've been doing instead of just something rushed and squeezed in between two other meetings where people are already distracted.
Yeah. Yeah, the type of retro as well. When I mean type is who do you have on the retro? I mean, the default is always with an internal development focus, generally around process, before how the team's working. But there's also incredible value by having the business partners attend a retro. You have to set it up differently, and the context of it might be different, or doing a retro with the key stakeholders at the client. We may be thinking we're doing the best thing since sliced bread on the project and delivering, 100 miles an hour and hitting all the targets. But if we're not achieving the business objectives the way that the stakeholder was expecting, then we're missing something. So,
Mhm.
and it can be, again, you don't have to have hundreds of these, but choosing the audience and what you're trying to get out of the retrospective might be valuable as well.
Yeah, I think being too busy to have a retro, I think that's already a sign that you have a problem. Like, and you may be more in need of a retro to help you with that overly busyness, firefighting, whatever you've got your team stuck in.
Yeah, I think similarly, like not setting the expectation for what the retro is intended to accomplish can easily lead to unbeneficial or unhelpful comments or criticism. So kind of setting the tone and keeping it in the right scope for, hey, here's what we're here to accomplish, here's what we're trying to do. Otherwise, it can quickly turn into, all right, let's just complain about everything that's not going well, everything we wish would be
Mhm.
different. And a lot of times, it's important to still identify, but like you may start just identifying all the things on the project that you don't have any control over anyway, and then it just turns into a venting session,
Oh,
which
I've
I
been
guess
on
has its
several.
place, at happy hour after work, but isn't super helpful if you're trying to identify ways the
Yeah,
project can improve.
years ago, not anything I experienced, of course, but at a past employer, just the retro on our team was such a depressing event because a number of people would just dominate, would just complain about everything. And right, like you said, things
Mhm.
are outside of their control, outside of our control. And it was just like no one looked forward to it. And
Mhm.
yeah, nothing and no real resolutions would come out of it. Like, oh, so and so's gonna complain about this again for like 10 minutes. Here we go.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's definitely just not constructive to a retro. I think, yeah, complaining, someone just dominating, really having no one to lead that
Mhm.
conversation.
Yeah, I
Not
like
only
to,
not conducive, I would say they're destructive, right? Because
Yeah.
those end up bringing the whole team down. So they're in worse shape and worse mental state and morale than they were coming into that retro. So really
yeah,
try to shut that down.
I like to do what are the positive things first. That at least gets people into a different
Hmm.
mindset as you lead in. If you start off with what are we not doing so good? That could be a long walk down a dark hole if you're not.
Yeah,
It's so much easier to fall on the negative than the positive.
yeah. Similarly, Andy, to what you were saying earlier about like who's on the call, what kind of a audience do you have? I think if you're having a retrospective and like the CEO and your boss and your clients and everyone who's in a position of authority is there, you might not have a very communicative audience who's willing to say what could be better and what could we improve. And granted, it's striking the balance between there may be times where there really is nothing you can do, and there are factors that aren't worth complaining about because nothing's going to change. But if you're in an environment where no one feels like they can safely bring up concerns or criticism, that's a big problem.
Yeah.
Not to say you can't have a retrospective with the boss or the manager or the client, but knowing how to navigate that in a way where people still feel like they can share honest feedback, or maybe having separate meetings for different priorities in what you're discussing for the retro.
Maybe the ideas that come out of the team retro are bubbled up
Hmm.
to the manager CEO level by a trusted leader of the group, but that way no one feels like they were outed as the person who spoke poorly. So yeah, maybe divide it up that way, and have just different ways of communicating the results. That's kind of what I see, at least if there are actions that need to be taken outside of the retro, and it might not be your team that can make the immediate change, but okay, here are the things I'll take this to leadership and we'll see if we can, apply those in the next sprints or weeks. Because oftentimes it may be suggestions and you can't act on them, but likewise, there should be some follow-up on these ideas and action items that come out of your retro. You shouldn't just vent and never revisit them. And that's
Right.
another thing I see in other retros too is, hey, we suggested doing this last time. Did that work? Should we keep
Mm.
doing that? That was something I liked in a style that another project manager I worked with on another client would essentially pin some of the top suggestions to the retro board that they were using, and that would get reused next week or next 2 weeks, or whatever. And we kind of see, okay, yeah, we said, I forgot we said we are going to do that. Okay, well, let's focus on it. Or no, that really didn't help. Just strike
Mhm.
it, strike it from the board.
I've created tickets coming out of the retrospective that we've tracked in the sprints. That way it
Mhm.
stays very visible and kind of forces whoever took the action to actually address it. And I'll fess up, if I don't have a list of things I'm meant to do, I'm likely to forget one or two. So having tickets that are visible in the
Mhm.
sprint, everyone can hold me accountable for is actually a
Yeah, I think that is very important. Also, another thing you shouldn't do is take a bite while you're on a podcast, or schedule retros while people are eating because they'll be distracted chewing. But I think that's one of the things that over time, if you don't follow up on the action items, then it'll make your retros less and less effective over time. Because once people notice that we have this, but nothing ever comes out of it, then why would I come in prepared and really share my honest thoughts and be so into it? Why bother with all of that if there's really no consequence that comes out of it?
Mhm.
So
And then,
you
yeah,
have to sort of stay on top of that and make sure that they feel like they're being heard and the feedback is being acted upon and enacted right through the processes.
yeah. If everyone on the retro feels like it's a waste of time, you're not going to be getting any quality feedback out of it. Everyone's going to be kind of half-heartedly participating anyway. So yeah, creating an environment where it feels like it's not only, hey, we value your time, we're glad everyone's here and participating, but also we appreciate the feedback and we'll do our best to implement it. And even just like bringing people into that process and, asking good follow-up questions can be really helpful. Like, okay, so you mentioned this. What could that look like if we implemented it? Do you have any ideas? Do you want to help create a plan to enact that change? Those kinds of things, rather than it just being, there's some manager who's running it and everyone gives them their notes and then there's no follow-up, there's no follow-through. It's just kind of a formality at that point. Okay, so those are all the things we shouldn't do on retrospective. So let's talk about what are the things you can do to make your retrospective successful from the beginning?
We mentioned earlier, I think you have to have someone in charge of running that. Not so much having all the ideas, but just running the conversation and to also take notes. Pretty lucky right now on the projects that I am on. The project manager does a great job of this. And so it's always very well run and the conversation flows, and we always have actionable notes from that retro. So I think the earlier situation I was talking about where, it was just people complaining, venting, there was sort of technically a leader in that, but they just weren't really taking that leadership role, I guess, seriously enough. So if you don't want the thing to devolve into just complaining, having someone who can really take charge and also, cut someone off if they're going on too long.
I've actually on longer projects, I've actually asked another PM or someone else to run the retrospective, take myself out of the loop. Because you can, as you say, if it's running long enough and you're spending, a lot of time with the same people over and over, you can miss things or it starts to get stale. So having someone completely not familiar with what's happened before, etc., step in can sometimes create, much more interesting feedback.
And honestly, I think it's okay to have a mediator that has no clue of the project as well, right? Because they're sort of there to make sure we're following the rules and there is no bias, right? So if the leader is part of the project, they might be a little biased or their own ideas or things that they've seen. They might prematurely shut down some other ideas,
Mhm.
where sort of a external disconnected third party mediator comes in, doesn't come with any of that, right? There's a
Mhm.
listing, making sure everyone gets heard, writing down in completeness all the things that are shared, and then presents it back to the group saying, here's what we have, let's prioritize and delegate.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I've never really thought about it that way because I could see another problem I was thinking about we haven't really talked about is where it tends to be one person dominating or some people just are always quiet. And yeah, the leader who's there all the time may just be used to like, oh, so and so probably won't speak up, so I won't bother them. But right, the new person may be more inclined to ask everybody explicitly, like, oh, hey, we haven't heard from you. What do you
Mhm.
think? And that might get them to speak up. I like that idea.
Yeah, some other ways I've seen to encourage everyone to participate, even if they're not comfortable talking in front of the group, is to use like a whiteboard or a tool. If you're in person and able to meet, that's great. But if it's an online conversation, which is probably, more often the case in at least our context, since we're more distributed, it might be like using some kind of a whiteboarding tool where, all right, everyone, we're going to take 5 minutes, grab your digital sticky notes and write down as many things that went well as you can think of, and then write down, we'll review those, then we'll take another 5 minutes and we'll write down all of the things that could be better. So that way, it's like, depending on the program, you may be able to have some anonymity from people. Sometimes it'll auto label who wrote what, but regardless, if someone's nervous about speaking up or isn't quite sure how to articulate it, but you give them some time to think and process, especially because some people are more vocal and some people need to think about it before they can share. It kind of helps to create space for both where everyone can participate and have the space to kind of gather their thoughts, so to speak, and have a targeted, like, hey, here's what we're talking about. Try to come up with a few things. And if you can't come up with anything, that's fine. You might think of something while we're reviewing what everyone else came up with, and then you can share. So that can be helpful, just leveraging those kinds of tools to give people a voice if they're usually uncomfortable.
Yeah, I tend to make the mistake of if there's silence on a subject, I tend to fill the silence. Just I don't know whether it's out of nervousness or just I won't shut up. But I tend to fill the blanks instead of waiting and letting people, ease into maybe giving a response, instead of cutting them off.
I suspect
Well,
that's why we're all on this podcast because I think we all probably have that problem.
well,
As you
and
know,
it's
so
harder when you're the one asking the question. You feel like, oh, did I not ask it right? Are people confused? And it feels like longer when you're waiting for other people to respond. But
mhm.
a lot of times people are like, they're thinking about what you said, they're pondering how they want to respond, and it's not taking as long as you think it is. It's
Yeah.
just,
Made
you know,
worse by Zoom. Like we don't have as much of that. Those
right.
those cues, right? So the silence feels, I don't know, 10x worse.
Hmm. I think similarly to like having the right tools in place is just communicating ahead of time. Hey, especially for people who are new on the project or you haven't done retros that much
Mhm.
before. Hey, here's what we're doing. Here's how long it's going to take. Here are the kinds of questions we'll be asking. Spend some time ahead of time thinking about it so that people can kind of be more prepared rather than you jump into a meeting and it's dropped on you like, hey, what are some things that you could have done better? What are some things that we could have done better? That can kind of put people on the spot. But whether it's sending out an agenda or kind of communicating, hey, here's the format it's going to be in, just so people are prepared and can have some time to think about it, that can be really, really helpful.
So I actually have noticed in projects that have run for a long time, where it's been the same team for years, actually sometimes I found the retro harder to have to at least think off the top of my head because we're all kind of used to each other. We've made a lot of improvements. So
Hmm.
you do actually really have to think a little bit more about, okay, what do I need to do? And sometimes what I've been doing lately is trying to like I've said, we had sprint retros during the sprint, especially if it's something early and it was something I wanted to bring up later, but it's not like I don't need to bring it up now. Like maybe those shout outs, leaving myself a note, in my calendar or wherever for that next retro. Because otherwise, we've definitely hit a lull sometimes where we're all sitting there quietly, just no one's really writing anything on our shared board. And I'm just really puzzling, like, what did we do? What was in the last demo? Because
Right.
sometimes this kind of blurs together. So you could almost say that sometimes you can take a pause on it. Maybe the retro action there is that you could take a break on the retros for a little while because over time you do all kind of gel and there's a lot more proactivity and less that needs to be fixed when the team's really working well. It's a good problem to have, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's also on the leader or the mediator to make sure everyone gets a chance to participate fully. As Johnny, you were saying, people communicate differently. And so if there's someone dominating, giving ample space for others to get their word in. So like if you're with Andy, who doesn't allow any silence, and then speaks up, not to pick on Andy, I do the same thing. But then the other person who may be a little more introverted might be just about to get ready and spinning up the engines to speak, and then someone speaks up instead, and then they do it again, and it happens again, right? So making sure, keeping track throughout, like how much has this person contributed, how much has this person, and trying to balance the scales as you go.
I think that's really important to try and create an environment where everybody feels comfortable adding a comment or endorsing something, or not opposing, but having an alternative view maybe and expressing that. I think that's tough to do, but very important if you can pull it off.
Yeah, if you're able to convince everyone, once again, this is under the assumption that it's a remote system where you're not gathering in person. If you're in person, it's easier, but if you're all kind of on a Zoom call, encouraging people to turn their cameras on can be a helpful way to kind of read people, especially the person running the meeting. If you can see like, oh, I can tell they're thinking, like the wheels are turning, but they haven't said anything yet, jogging back and saying, hey, I've noticed that it looks like you have some thoughts on this. Do you have anything you'd like to share, or do you need some more time to think about it? Not doing it in a way that is embarrassing people or calling them out in an inappropriate way. But if someone doesn't have the kind of gumption to thrust themselves into the conversation, but you can tell that they've got something to say and they've been kind of quiet, but it seems like they're really paying attention, just giving them the floor and saying, hey, is there anything that you've been thinking about as we've been going through this meeting? So that's kind of on the person running the meeting. Like, are they able to kind of read the room and see if there are people who are just checked out? And if you were to ask them, they'd be like, oh, I don't even know what we're talking about, versus there are probably people who are more engaged but haven't spoken up yet. They probably have something to say. They just don't know how to put it yet.
Fun
I think
fact,
another
that's exactly why we have cameras on when we're recording this podcast, even though it's audio only, right? So we can pick
Right.
up on those same cues as we go along and interrupt each other. So go ahead, Phil.
which mean well, we were just demonstrating why it was important to have that visual cue so you could avoid that interruption.
Exactly.
We did kind of touch on the tools and having like things like shared whiteboards or like Fig Jams and Confluence. And I don't know if we really mentioned though, one logistical way of running a retro is having a preset time up front for people to collect all those thoughts, put them on the board, and then the discussion happens after. Because I think that's definitely especially for the more introverts, where being on the spot, because in retros, it's more like, okay, I'm going to go to each person, they're going to share their ideas. That is definitely where I think I've seen more of the just complaints or just quiet, or you just kind of throw the first thought out there, but then having like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to sit and think. Maybe like half of that is me looking at the last sprint demo list to be like, what did we actually do? But then it's a roundtable discussion, like essentially in that, now please elaborate on your cards. And that seems to work pretty well in the retros I've been in lately.
Yeah, I've been the last few larger retros, not necessarily sprint ones because they're a little more contained, but I've sent the retro document out with all of the different categories ahead of time. And people have populated their thoughts into those sections before we even get into the start of the session, which one, it allows the meeting to be a little bit shorter, but it also allows the mediator to talk about what might be a contentious point without someone having to raise it. So that's worked actually pretty well.
I think that's a very important point, whether you have people fill it out before the session or dedicate a first part of the session to do it. I think the key thing is making sure everyone contributes their ideas individually. Whereas if you go in turn and ask each one, that quickly leads to sort of unoriginal, repetitive ideas. Like the second or third person will say, oh yeah, I want just what he said or what she said, right? The same thing. They won't come with their own ideas. So not letting each person see others sort of feedback before discussion is key.
And you can cluster the common themes too. I think after you've done that, you can see, well, this is clearly bothering everyone because we got like 3 or 4 cards on the board, post-its on the board related to this one issue. So we'll focus on that first.
Yeah, I think that goes along with, it's easy to, talk about a lot of stuff and then not do anything with it, but taking the time to gather the feedback, organize it, share, hey, here are the main findings we got, and then prioritize, okay, here's what we're going to do for this, here's what we're going to do for that. communicating that whole process, even if it's, we had the retrospective, the person who's running it, okay, I'm going to go organize it, and then I'll share with the rest of the group after it's kind of been processed and prioritized. Here's what we're changing. Just having that clear communication throughout all of it can be helpful for making sure that people feel like they were heard, but also like the meeting was actually productive. And like, hey, here's what's happening now as a result, instead of, well, that was good. Thanks for sharing all your thoughts. We'll do this again in a month and we'll see what happens in the meantime. Like just having that clear communication and showing like, here's what we're doing with the feedback can be really helpful.
I think one way is just following up on that is give them ownership, right? Some might be great ideas. Instead of just taking it away, you can also delegate and say, okay, why don't you come back for next time with an idea of how we do implement that great idea you came up with, right? So that gives them a sense of ownership, and they're sort of more, they dive deeper into it, so that they want to come to the next one with things thought out, and they feel that, yes, there are more actions happening now based on my feedback.
How often do you guys think it's helpful to have retrospectives, or like, is there a point where it's like, oh, that's too much, it's a burden? Because I feel like that's a hard balance to strike.
I think I'm starting to see a little bit of maybe we're doing it too frequently. So I think the running out of ideas. I'd say like, I mean, early on after each sprint, it just seems obvious, but I don't know, once a month for an ongoing project seems like a good safe amount. And then I don't know, for larger projects, larger milestones, quarterly. I don't know what everyone else thinks.
Yeah, I like the month or every other sprint, or depending on what your sprint lengths are, like, or even on the longer projects, you make it like you can have a monthly, then a quarterly.
Yeah.
Having weekly ones for me tends to get very quickly into, you're just doing it to check a box instead of trying to drive real value. And nothing, I mean, things change over time. They don't normally, there's nothing that normally happens in a week, unless there's a disaster of some sort. But then you're not having a retro about it, then you're into a risk management situation as opposed to a retro. So I don't know. I don't like the weekly. I'm not sure that adds enough value, but certainly, on a monthly basis, it's not a bad idea.
It should be enough to where people have time to think about it and feel like it's a meeting where they can bring novel ideas. If it just gets treated just like as another repetitive meeting that just happens on a recurring schedule, then that novel factor sort of goes away a little bit, and it's treated like every other meeting. And so monthly, bi-monthly as in every 2 months, not twice a month, is what my take would be, I guess. There are definitely extremes. Every week would be one extreme, and only at the end of a project would be another extreme. But of course, it needs to vary based on the size of the project, the term, how long it is, complexity, things like that.
I think the time between the retros, it also just depends on the context too. So yeah, like an end of project retro is a different thing from the normal sprint operational retro. So like each of those obviously have different cadences.
Thanks for connecting with us today. If you have a complex software problem that needs solving, thoughts on what we discussed today, or ideas on what topics we should tackle next, feel free to reach out to us at podcast@experoinc.com or on Twitter @experoinc. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you next time.
The only tangent I had when Andy mentioned sliced bread is that they've now come out with a new thing in sliced bread, where for avocado toast, they're actually putting the avocado in between the toast.
So now it'll be the newest thing since pre-avocado bread.
Yeah, exactly.
Like 2 slices of bread with avocado in between?
No, like one loaf with avocado inside it, like
wow.
avocado filled bread.
How does that not go bad? Like,
Yeah, I feel like that wouldn't end well.
I'm guessing those
avocado
avocados are not organic then.
Green colored styrofoam.
Filling, yeah.